Hey guys, welcome to Module 4. And I just want to go over and talk about some of the few key areas of the criminal justice system in the Civil War era, which is going to be from 1856 to about 1876. I think it's important to note overall that the Civil War brought some extraordinary problems to the criminal justice system, and we're going to touch on some of those. And hopefully you'll walk away with a different perspective in terms of what was going on during this period of time and some of the reasons behind some of the actions of the criminal justice system as it began to progress to where we are today. Um, Years leading up to the Civil War brought numerous critical issues dividing the nation. Cities were facing rapid growth, and the wealth and rise of the Industrial Revolution, along with racial and ethnic tensions, was beginning to take place, especially in a lot of our more urban areas of the country. The key criminal justice issues during the Civil War was the suspension of civil liberties, and more specifically, the writ of habeas corpus, which had to do with the whole idea of incarcerating people without due process of law. And so this was done during the period of time and, was approved by President Lincoln, and not trying to second guess his motives at the time because really no other president has had to deal with the type of issues that Lincoln had dealt with. But just know that during certain periods of time, these type of liberties were in fact suspended, and at the time it was legal to do so. In the South, we began to see the development of black codes because once the Civil War had ended, and during the Reconstruction period, many Southern states instituted what became known as black laws. And these were laws that were trying to erect a legal structure that would permit the economic exploitation of blacks by granting them technical freedom. Okay? And so one such black code was the Mississippi Black Code, and that's outlined on page 145 of your book. And let me just read what it says. And in part, this was section 3 of the Mississippi Black Code. It said, "Be it further enacted that it shall not be lawful for any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto to intermarry with any white person, nor any white person to intermarry with any freedman, free Negro, or mulatto. Any person who shall intermarry shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and on conviction thereof shall be confined to the state penitentiary for life." So here we were trying to the Mississippi legislature, through their black code, was trying to regulate the marriage between whites and basically non-whites. Now, the civil rights legislation and due process, some of the key amendments that were important during this era were the 13th Amendment, which was the abolishment of slavery, the 14th Amendment, which was providing equal protection and citizenship to black slaves, the 15th Amendment, which basically said you can't prevent voting because of race. We also began to see the influence of the Ku Klux Klan as a means to intimidate sympathetic whites, as well as several black citizens during this time period. And then we saw the act to enforce the 14th Amendment, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was a means to further allow the full acceptance of blacks as non-slaves in this country. So if anything, you really began to see the rise and influence of the federal government through its establishment of these legal amendments as a means to regulate and control large sections of the country. Specifically, they were trying to change the behavior of many of the southern states at the time. We began to see the birth of drug legislation, and drug legislation was established initially against marginalized segments of the population. So an example here, laws were established on the use of opium, which targeted the Chinese, use of cocaine, which targeted African Americans, use of marijuana, which targeted Hispanics primarily. So we began to see legislation as a means to control certain marginalized parts of our population. And some people say a lot of that still takes place today, and you can evaluate that for yourself. But when you look at crack cocaine versus regular powder cocaine, the punishment is significantly more. It used to be a lot more until probably about 5, maybe 10 years ago, where Congress reduced the penalties associated with crack cocaine. It is still probably 5 times more than powdered cocaine. But crack cocaine, as you know, is often used by minorities, and powdered cocaine is often used by affluent or middle class white people. So you can evaluate that on your own as you read through that portion of the text. Law enforcement beginning in this time period obviously began to change as well. Major U.S. cities began to establish more proficient police forces that emphasized prevention over detection. Creation of police to control dangerous classes, and we discussed some of those dangerous classes: the Hispanics, the Chinese, African Americans. But also, in a period of time, it also began to see the migration of other Europeans. For example, the Irish later became a dangerous class. Roman Catholics later became seen as a dangerous class because that's often associated with the Irish. So we began to see the use of police to control these dangerous type classes of our society. The first black police officers were noted in northern cities beginning in about the 1870s. So the assimilation of blacks into the profession began to take place during the early part of the 1870s. You can take a look at this slide on your own. It just talks about urban policing and conflict between state and local control, and then the roles of U.S. Marshals. So again, we began to see more increase in the use of federal law enforcement as a means of enforcing federal law. State policing did not have a whole lot of support initially, and as you read through the textbooks, you'll find that many states did not have state police. There was little support for us. But the different types and styles of state policing you'll find in the country are different. For example, in California, we have the California Highway Patrol. And the California Highway Patrol is primarily responsible for enforcement of the vehicle code and traffic violations and laws on our interstate highways and in our non-incorporated areas of the county. California did have a state police, and then that was incorporated by the California Highway Patrol for efficiency measures. But even at that time, the state police was only involved in enforcing, protecting state property. We did have other state elements such as Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement and the Department of Justice, but not in the context of policing streets and so forth. So state policing has various types depending on the state and how that particular state's structured. But just know that initially there wasn't a whole lot of support for state police. Corrections: the rise in prison populations following the Civil War. The role of the reformatory movement and the South implemented convict leasing. So these are key significant factors that began to occur. We're going to talk about a couple of those here in just a moment. Convict leasing, for example, was a process whereby a contractor could use cheap prison labor as on assorted projects. And this was a cheap way for a business to produce a product. You'll read about later that it was later ruled, federal law later prohibited this because it provided certain businesses an unfair advantage over other businesses and the ability to sell a product cheaper than those who did not use prison labor. Right? So just know we had convict leasing. The Irish system was a series of graduated prison stages, 3 different stages, and basically the whole concept of ticket of release. And basically it's the implementation of parole. So we began to look at ways to release people from custody who began to show that they had served an initial period of time and they had behaved themselves within the institution, and so they were allowed an early release, ticket of release at the time. And so it was sort of the precursor to our modern day parole system. We began to see the Elmira Reformatory, which is set up for use between the ages of 16 and 30 who were serving their first prison term. And it used indeterminate sentencing and mark system, modern day parole. So mark system is similar to good time. So if you behave yourself, you get some time taken off your sentence. Intermediate sentence is basically you're sentenced to a period of 5 to 10 years. And if you behave yourself, maybe you get out in 5, maybe you get out in 6. If you don't behave yourself, you might end up serving your whole 10 years. But the whole idea here is that we began to look at different types of philosophies in terms of how we're going to deal with people that we punish. And the use of indeterminate sentencing and mark system was one of those systems that we began to think about. So this is during the reformatory period. And it was supposed to be a very progressive idea. However, what they ended up finding eventually is that people were being punished severely inside the institution. In other words, there was abuse. And so those type of reformatories disappeared. Most criminal activity during this period of time was associated with petty theft, embezzlement, larceny, gambling, prostitution, drunkenness, disorderly conduct. What we began to see was professional criminals were technically superior to the police. Right? So the police still had issues associated with their ability to advance to that level of professionalism, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. You're going to begin during this time to see the birth of organized crime. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just you can begin to read it and understand how it began to formulate and in what areas that organized crime began to associate itself. Capital punishment, basically capital punishment became less public. When it became less public, reformers disappeared because they couldn't see a person being executed, and so they basically moved on to something else. Some research suggested that there was certain bias towards ethnic groups such as Irish, race, African American, religion, Catholics, in selecting cases for military criminals for execution. So we begin to see where there might have been some level of bias towards specific ethnic groups. Remember, these are, at the time, the marginalized segments of our society. Violence in the 1850s, we saw a resurgence in sectional violence over slavery issues. Also contributing to the rising tide of violence in the 1850s was the growth of American gun production. So the whole idea of guns, all right, and we're still dealing with gun growth in this country and issues with gun violence, but know that it's not anything new. The book's going to talk about domestic terrorism. You can take a look at that, but also understand that we began to see some of these things begin to take place during periods of riots, okay, where people were protesting poor living conditions, or in one case, Irish draftees. This is drafting for the war to go to the South and fight to flee slaves. Many of the Irish did not do this because they believed that if slaves were free, they would take their jobs away from them in the North, work cheaper. But again, you're going to start beginning to see a lot of racial tension and social issues pop up that's going to generate a lot of conflict and rioting within our country during this time. And it was something that the police were going to have to learn how to deal with. You can read about the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail there. Interracial violence, again, you could see that. Certain Southerners refused to recognize emancipation of blacks, and on occasion freedmen were beaten, killed, and mutilated. Local law enforcement outsupported white Southerners. In the South, justice continued to be color conscious for the blacks. Significant amount of Indian and white confrontations were beginning to occur in the West. And let me just touch on a couple things here real quickly before we close. Hold on one second. Okay, I just want to conclude real quick that the Civil War generated extraordinary problems in the American criminal justice system. By its conclusion in 1865, many of the system's components had been altered or modified due to the war. The abolition of slavery and return of traumatized war veterans to every region of the country will lead to a rise in crime and a strain on the courts, policing, and the prisons within this country. So this chapter, again, the focus is going to be on the Civil War, after the Civil War, the impact it had on the country. Anytime you have a period following a war, you have a lot of people coming back, you have a lot of people unemployed, social issues may be high, and you're going to have a lot of conflict and tension, right? And those things are going to most definitely impact the criminal justice system. All right, so that's chapter 7. I hope this helps, and wish everyone a great week. Thank you.